Hi there. Welcome to the Heartwood Forest Protection Podcast, a place where we talk with people who have dedicated their lives to protecting forests. We discuss current threats to our forests, learn what we can do to make a difference, and get to know the people who make up Heartwood and the forest protection movement. Thanks for joining us.
You shine like a diamond in the sun. When others lost you won.
Hi, my name is Jillian Barav, and this is the second of 4 interviews I did with Andy Mahler during the summer of 2025. This one takes place on July 14th and digs deep into the founding of the Heartwood organization. Thanks for listening. Hi, Andy.
Hello, Jillian.
I'm so glad to be with you again today, and I want to focus on how you made your way into forest protection activism and the creation of Heartwood.
Yeah. Well, I often refer to myself as an accidental activist. And another way I characterize it is that I arrived in the forest as an empty vessel and the forest filled me up. So the forest bears more responsibility for the choices I made than I maybe do myself, in the sense that the forest spoke to me, and to the extent that I was able to be attuned to what the forest was telling me, the forest spoke through me, to where I was not doing it as an outsider, but as the forest speaking on its own behalf. I tried to be a voice for the forest. And that came to me, like I said, through my deeper interactions with the forest, my deeper understanding of the forest, but then most importantly of all, my deeper connection to the forest, where a forest is not an abstraction, a forest is not a location on a map, a forest is not a concept, a forest is a living entity. And to the extent that you accept that that living entity has intentionality and purpose, and you find yourself to be part of that intentionality and purpose, then it gets to a point where you really have no choice but to say, this is harm being done to my larger body, to my larger frame, to my larger sense of self, to my larger community. So forest is a community, and I've been blessed and privileged to be a part of that community. And what that really even relates back to further, and I think we talked about this last time, but I don't remember, was the fact that I was drawn to the forest. I was called to the forest. There's something about driving south from Bloomington, the college town where I grew up, as a sort of Midwestern suburban kid. You drive south on Highway 37, and this was before they straightened and 4-laned big chunks of it. And the road, there were stretches where it was straight, stretches where it would go through farm fields, little towns. But when you get to Orange County, it just went snaggly. Because right in the middle of Highway 37 in Orange County, you're driving down a highway, and right in the middle of the highway is the courthouse. You get to Paola, you come down this hill on North Gospel Street, and there's this just amazingly sweet and iconic, Linda comments on how often we hear that term used on television and radio and elsewhere. Everything's iconic these days. Well, the Orange County Courthouse is iconic. It just looks like it encompasses and embodies all the ideals of civic virtue, justice, and social organization within its physical structure. Whether any of those things are actually represented in the functionings within it, the building it's aspirational in terms of a country founded on principles that it hasn't always lived up to. So that's what I see in the courthouse. Anyway, here's this courthouse in the middle of the road. And then there's a square around the courthouse, which is actually a circle. And then south of that courthouse, it goes down, and there's Lick Creek. And there's an old iron bridge over the creek. And south of their roads, there's no rhyme or reason. And I remember the first time I came to Peoria, I think I was hitchhiking, and it's just like, here's this world of wildness. The roads are snaggly, there's big trees, the level of population density seems to diminish with the increased ruggedness of the land. And there's something about the wildness of the land here that really spoke to me. Plus, Orange County is remarkable in other ways. It's the Buffalo Trace sort of defines uh, the settlement of southern Indiana, and it runs right through Orange County. And the Buffalo Trace flows from the springs and the mineral springs and the forest, because this was the path that the bison used, but following the bison were the deer and all the various other wildlife, and also the indigenous people. And then the pioneers settled it following that same travel way. So you can see the entire history, I mean, to some extent of the North American continent, but certainly of the state of Indiana in Orange County, by just sort of coming to a deeper understanding of the Buffalo Trace and the relationship between the human settlers, whether indigenous or pioneer, because you see the marks on the landscape of the people who've been here before, and it's still very much present in our daily surroundings. So anyway, all of that spoke to me, but in ways I couldn't articulate. I mean, I didn't have any clue what was going on at the time, but these are all things that have been revealed to me, and are just things that enrich my understanding of the nature of my own experience, but the nature of the human experience, the nature of our nation's history. All these things are written large, but also in microcosm in Orange County. And one of the dominant features, of course, of the landscape is the forest. Not one of, the dominant feature of the landscape is the forest. But the forest is not a thing in and of itself, because the forest is a manifestation of the substrata, of the minerals, the limestone, the sandstone, the weathering of the limestone and the sandstone to create soil, the dropping of leaves over eons to create dense, rich topsoil, and then how all the pieces of that are woven together through the fungal networks, the wildlife, the microorganisms. It's just a deep and complex interconnectivity. Once again, none of this was stuff I could articulate when I first got here, but now it's become so clear to me because it is ingrained in my DNA and certainly in my consciousness. So that's the forest. So, but I didn't know any of that, or at least not to where I could articulate, but I did know I loved being in the forest. And Linda, my dear wife, who was at that time a dear friend, had horses. And what we used to do is, I may have mentioned this last time, take acid and go ride horses in the snow. I mean, it was like, how could it possibly be any better than that? Riding through the forest in a state of full, joyful, loving consciousness with dear friends, and then go back to the house, which is now my house. Afterwards, put a big fire in the fireplace, throw some feather beds on the floor in front of the fireplace. Linda was making homemade bread. We would bring food. It was just a really magical and wonderful time. But so then as we were riding our horses in the woods, we started seeing clear cuts, big clear cuts. And one clear cut in particular, they dropped it right on top of the horse trail. 40-acre clear cut. It was like, what is this? Deep ruts, transmission fluid, bottles or cans or whatever they're called, lying in oily ditches. Just utter devastation. Big, beautiful hardwood trees, beautiful trees, just entering into the prime of their own existence. Cut, but not just the big trees, everything over 2 inches cut down and left in this horrid jumble. And it's like, why would anybody do that? And is this the national forest? I mean, so, I was new to the county at that time, and I felt, what if this is what life is like in Orange County, then I guess I'm just going to have to accept it and adapt to it, because I did not feel empowered in the slightest to express an opinion, because I didn't know if I was entitled to an opinion as a newcomer to what may have been a conventional practice. But then the more I talked to my neighbors, I found out, no, nobody liked it. Certainly the horse riders hated it, and the loggers hated it. Why would you cut down all these trees that in another 10 years would be commercially valuable and just leave them lying on the forest floor? It made no sense to the loggers either. So once I started to hear that other people did not approve of what they were seeing, and what they were seeing was something just almost incomprehensible, I realized that okay, I can express an opinion because I would be talking with a logger, for instance, and say, no, I can't stand that clear cutting. It's just I don't understand what the government is doing. So that was first one of the questions because the horse trail at that time mostly was on national forest. And once again, I didn't necessarily know where we were riding. I didn't know where any of these ownership lines were. All I knew is we were riding through the forest, and I loved being in the forest. So we discovered that it was happening on the national forest, and that it was being done by the agency that all of us assumed had been established to protect the forest, the Forest Service. Why would the Forest Service be cutting down the forest? It just made no sense to me. Anyway, but still, uh, green kid, no clue. I just sort of let it pass. But the other thing that was happening at that time in a big, big way was young men mostly, but men and women, because young people tend to gather together, were running through the forest with four-wheel drive pickup trucks and just creating these mud holes and running their vehicles through these mud holes. And then there was something else that sort of appeared on the scene right around that time. There were, of course, dirt bikes. There were these things called three-wheelers, ORVs, off-road vehicles. So I was concerned. Didn't know that many people in the county, but the ones I did know, they were concerned. Especially the closer you lived to the forest, the more aware you were of what was happening. And so one night, one evening, there was a little ad in the paper, and I've referred to this ad frequently. It was like maybe 40 words, if that, because we received in the mail a letter from the Forest Service saying, blah, 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 ORV trails, blah, 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 that they were approving 112 miles of dirt bike and 3 and 4-wheeler ATV trails in Orange County. I mean, 112 miles, 56 of those miles would be in Brown County, which is a couple counties to the north, and here in Orange County, where we lived. And it's like you are going to actually encourage this kind of use of this sacred land. And I already felt it was sacred. I may not have used those terms, but this is such a special and precious thing to be able to see the natural beauty, abundance, and diversity of the forest itself, not the forest as defined or managed by humans, but the forest itself as a living entity. And to see it so disrespected, I'd say, is part of it, and and degraded, just offended my sensibilities. And also, we certainly did not like the sound of ORVs running past our house in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day. And this proposal that they had issued would have had 125,000 of them a year running, essentially near our house in the forest. So there was this little ad appeared. Those concerned about the ORV proposal, there will be a meeting at the county complex, such and such a night, such and such a time. Tiny little ad. So Linda and I went because I was concerned, and I didn't have a natural tendency to be an activist, but I certainly had a natural tendency to be an organizer and to feel a certain sense of civic responsibility and social engagement that had me doing various kinds of things, starting organizations and helping start organizations at different times. I've always had a sort of, I don't know why, but this tendency to want to see something that doesn't exist, that should exist, and try and figure out how to help make it exist. Not through my own actions necessarily, but by finding other people who shared that dream or that vision and assembling a team of people who had that shared vision, but each of whom brought a different set of life experiences and different set of skills. So we went to this meeting, and there was a big rain that night in Orange County. There were 5 inches of rain fell in a matter of just a few hours. There was water standing in the streets. And even despite this huge rain, the meeting room was packed. I mean, it was overflowing, and lots of people were apparently concerned about these ORVs and the clear cutting, not just Linda and me, and not just our close neighbors. And there was a representative from the Sierra Club who came to the meeting, somebody from Bloomington, to tell us more about what was going on. and there was a representative from Senator Lugar's office and maybe some other political figures there, I don't recall. But it was a powerful assemblage just because clearly something had struck a nerve. And as a result of that meeting, an additional meeting or two was scheduled, and from there, Protector Woods was formed. Protector Woods had astonishing degree of success, despite hearing from the forest supervisor at the time that the comments in favor of the off-road vehicle trails were running 9-1 in support. He even said at one point 99-1 in support. We doubted it, but we did go into the Forest Service office and read every complaint. And what we found out later, of course, was the Forest Service had been speaking to the off-road vehicle groups and encouraging them to get their letters in early if they wanted these trails. Now, the Forest Service, to be fair, really didn't care about the trails that much themselves. The trails served two useful purposes for the Forest Service. They separated out the trails portion of the Hoosier National Forest Land and Resource Management Plan from the rest of the plan so that they could approve the rest of the plan and start implementing it while the public was diverted to the off-road vehicle trails. And the other thing that they did was, we later discovered, that they used supposed demand for off-road recreation or motorized recreation as a justification for building logging roads, because then they could charge the costs of building the logging roads to the recreation budget instead of to the timber budget, and in that way hide the fact that they were losing millions of dollars a year on their timber sales. Anyway, we only found this out later. As I mentioned, we had this amazing organizing effort. And I have to say, I threw myself into it with everything I had. I've always been a person who dabbled in this, dabbled in that, and just enjoyed the variety of activities that life offers to somebody who wants to live their life as fully as possible. But suddenly, all these different skill sets I'd learned from, I think I may have mentioned this last time, from playing music with other people, playing volleyball with other people, these things that seem sort of not frivolous, but certainly not, of great civic importance. All these skills became very valuable. Stuff I'd done in theater class in college, learning how to be on stage, learning how to organize a small group of people to mask the deficiencies and amplify the strengths of the people involved. So I learned a lot of that stuff through Protector Woods. Protector Woods stopped the off-road vehicle trail proposal, got the entire Hoosier National Forest closed to off-road vehicles, first national forest in the country officially designated. So we had a little wind in our sails as we turned to deal with the larger issue, and that was the forest plan that was being implemented, and that's what was doing all the clear cutting. But we were able to get the forest plan withdrawn and the new forest plan adopted. And so this was in the late 80s.
And are you talking about the forest plan for all the national forests or just what was happening on the Hoosier?
Thank you. It's just for the Hoosier, because here's the deal. In 1976, a law had been passed called the National Forest Management Act that required that every national forest in the country develop a plan and that all activities proposed and implemented be tiered to that plan. So this was the National Forest Management Land and Resource Management Plan for the Hoosier that we were dealing with. But anyway, we started learning all about forestry and public policy and the law related to public forests. And it was really a crash course in forest policy and forest management, courtesy of the USDA Forest Service. And I've often said that the Forest Service, even though it was certainly not their intention, did me a huge favor by putting me in touch with the finest people I have ever met, including yourself. We met the people who had decided that their lives were going to make a difference, at least to the extent they could, in trying to make the world a better place. So with Protector Woods, our initial thought was that we were starting a forest protection organization. But then we realized, no, wait a minute, this isn't just about the forest. This is about something, maybe a deeper or more inclusive concept, and that concept is justice. Because when you see something that's being proposed and being implemented, especially if it's being done at public expense and in the name of public virtue, that is clearly neither cost effective nor beneficial, you have to call into question not only what is being proposed, but if something is bad, surely there must be something good that we could be working towards. And that has always motivated, once again, not necessarily knowing that that's what I was doing at the time. I've always been more motivated by the positive vision than by the negative consequence. And also by the desire to live a life of meaning and purpose and to find something. So after we defeated the off-road vehicle trail proposal and got the Hoosier National Forest Plan withdrawn and rewritten, most of the people who had started to protect our woods went back to their lives. They had kids, they had mortgages, they had businesses to run. I had a wife with a job. Linda was a school teacher. I was doing various types of work for money, but to a great extent, she and I both decided that we didn't need two incomes. More important than two incomes was somebody to take care of this vast and sprawling place with all its crumbling infrastructure. So that was my primary responsibility, was to keep the buildings from falling down, keep the rain from landing on our bedroom and stuff like that. But other people returned to their lives. I realized, you know what? There's really nothing more important I could be doing with my life than what we have just done on the Hoosier. And what we were seeing too is that, yes, we were actually able to stop the logging on the Hoosier National Forest. I mean, we shut them down. Now, there were several contracts that were still in effect, and we made the decision, and I'm not sure I would make the same decision now, to just let them go ahead and complete those contracts, but with the understanding that when those contracts were complete, there were not going to be any more clear cuts in Orange County, or the Hoosier National Forest for that matter. And that was basically the path we struck, and we stuck with it. And, you know, there were no more clear cuts in Orange County. Of course, now they don't call them clear cuts. They don't call them timber sales. Now it's restoration. See, this is the whole semantic shell game that the Forest Service plays. So they did, when they put in this new forest plan, it turns out between the forest plan being drafted by the local Forest Service and going up to the regional forest to be for final approval and being returned to the forest for adoption, it turns out the regional forest staff had changed a few provisions in the plan, and all those provisions had to do with salvage. Salvage, which meant that if there was an insect infestation, a disease outbreak, a windstorm, whatever it might be, then trees could be removed for salvage. Not as a timber sale, mind you, so they weren't required to make money, but they could take the trees out because it was supposedly in the good of the forest or in the good of the U.S. Treasury. We wouldn't have known that, except there was somebody working for the Forest Service who brought it to our attention, said, Andy, you need to pay attention to this. And of course, later we found out why they'd inserted all that. Because since we shut them down, they have never done any more timber sales. I mean, yes, they sell trees, but they don't call them, the primary motive is not selling the timber. The primary motive is something else. And they've gone through several iterations. The first one was salvage. And many of us who were alive and around at the time remember the terrible and infamous salvage rider signed into law by Bill Clinton with Newt Gingrich providing the congressional support, which basically gave the Forest Service free rein to cut as much timber as they could, provide they could justify it as salvage everywhere in the country. And so there were millions of board feet cut in the name of salvage in the early 90s. And then from salvage, it went to stewardship, and then we'll get to Buffalo Springs later. By the time we got around to Buffalo Springs, the Forest Service had perfected the terminology. They call it restoration or ecosystem restoration. It looks exactly the same as a clear cut, mind you, on the ground, but public supports restoration where they don't support clear cutting. The public supports restoration where they don't support below cost timber sales, and so forth. So that was the salvage. I'm getting a little ahead of the story. So what really happened then is we realized that the damage that had been done to the Hoosier was now being just relocated elsewhere. The demand was still there. The pressure from the Forest Service on their various staff and managers in the various other forests in the region was actually intensifying. So for every tree that we stopped them from cutting on the Hoosier, there's a high likelihood that the Wayne National Forest, which at that time was managed by the same supervisor's office in Bedford, Indiana, that they would just shift the damage to southern Ohio, where there was less organized opposition. And that was intolerable from a position of justice. This notion that somehow by protecting what we loved, we jeopardized or actually endangered the beloved places that other people cared for. And even if there's nobody in place who actually knew or loved that place, we knew it was lovable and we knew it was sacred. And it deserved the same degree of protection we had found we were able to achieve for significant portions of the Hoosier National Forest. Now, around this time, a guy named Ned Fritz out of Texas with a group called the Texas Committee on Natural Resources had been organizing in Texas and elsewhere to ban clear cutting because the National Forest Management Act was adopted in response to clear cutting in West Virginia and elsewhere in order to outlaw clear cutting, when in fact what the bill did in effect was legalize clear cutting under specific limited circumstances, such as that the clear cutting could only be used if it was the only method that could achieve the desired result. But then they always tailored the desired result so that clear cutting became the preferred method of achieving that result. And we were finding that instead of banning clear cutting, the National Forest Management Act actually emboldened the Forest Service to use clear cutting as much as possible everywhere based on the flimsiest of scientific rationales, but that was good enough for them. So there was this clear cutting happening all across the United States, but I wasn't familiar with all across the United States, but certainly familiar with Indiana. And Ned, in his quest to ban clear cutting, had organized a little, I'm not sure what you would call it, a little tour where he'd hired a pilot and a photographer, and they were going across to these forests in the eastern United States, these small Weeks Act forests in the eastern United States, trying to find the activists in these different communities and putting them together in a national network, grassroots network, because the national environmental groups, Sierra Club, Wilderness Society, Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, they were playing the inside ball game, where they felt that access to the rooms where the decisions were being made was more important than standing on a specific principle. So they were always willing to cut a deal. And, in a place like the Hoosier National Forest, what that deal would look like was we will protect the favored recreational areas near Indianapolis and Bloomington, the concentrations of sort of educated, relatively well-to-do recreationists. We would protect these areas, and in exchange for protecting these areas, these major national green groups would sign off on plans that called for, significant devastation to the other parts of the forest, including, in our case, Orange County. So Ned visited various people. He stopped in Southern Illinois, met Mark Donham and Christy Hansen, met Jan Wilder. But part of what we got through our visit with Ned was the sense, there are other people like us, like Protector Woods in these other states. And then so we started meeting these other folks. I met Jan Wilder Thomas at a meeting in Kentucky. John Wallace from Southern Illinois actually visited us at the Lazy Black Bear here in Southern Indiana and invited us to come over to Illinois. And I'd say really the landmark event in the formation of Heartwood was a visit that Linda and I paid to Southern Illinois, where we met the folks from RACE. And RACE had started as a group called ACE, Association of Concerned Environmentalists. And that was primarily Mark and Christy and Jan. But they were in the eastern half of the forest. And over in the western half of the forest, there was a group of people, including Bill Cronin, Mindy Harmon, Joe Glisson, Jackie Turner, John Wallace, and the other folks around the Carbondale area. And they got together with the folks from the eastern part of the forest, and they established RACE, the Regional Association of Concerned Environmentalists. And so when we went to Illinois, it was truly epic. We could do a whole hour on that visit because it was astonishing, extraordinary, and the bonds of connection between the people and the people who already had the bond of connection to the land over there, and the people had the bonds of connection here in Indiana, that it was just like a chemical reaction. We just found our family. And it was so powerful and so profound to realize because here's the deal: the people that end up forming Heartwood, many of them had similar backgrounds to what mine was. A lot of them were college educated, although several had decided to go to the land instead of to college. But we've been part of the, this whole 60s and early 70s thing of against the war, trying to find alternative ways of doing and being within social structures that didn't require sort of compromising fundamental values in order to achieve financial stability and comfort. Things that, maybe people felt like their parents had made compromises. And of course, those compromises were made for the benefit of the kids, but the kids felt, well, thank you for doing that. But, we're not going to do that. We're not going to compromise our fundamental values to fit into a system that is fundamentally flawed or unjust or pursues odious colonial wars in other parts of the world. But anyway, we lost the culture wars. Yes, we stopped the Vietnam War, but in fact, we did not create a new utopia on earth or a new. So a lot of us just sort of retired to the forest to lick our wounds and create our own realities on a very small scale. We hope to transform the society. That did not happen, but we felt that, and I'm speaking for myself here, but I think I can project it onto others' intention. We intended to make the world a better place, like by finding a piece of land, building a home of intention and purpose, and as light a footprint on the land as possible, growing as much food as possible, or the healthiest possible food, making our own music, making our own social structures, creating these alternative realities. And on a very, very small scale, a lot of people were just sort of isolated in their forest homes. Others found community nearby. A lot of these were near college towns: Carbondale, Fayetteville in Arkansas, Athens in Ohio, Columbia in Missouri. These are the places where the college context was within close enough proximity to the forest context that the people who had found their purpose through this growing of food and making of a different way of living and producing, art and, like I say, healthy food and self-made music. This was sort of the larger framework within which Heartwood took shape. And so what Linda and I started doing is going and visiting these other places. Now, Linda could only do it on the weekends, and sometimes, I would go off by myself. But the meetings in Illinois were epochal. And as a result of these connections we made with people in Ohio, Donnie Wirtschafter was one of the first people we met in Ohio. And then through Donnie, we met Joe Hazelbaker, and boy, in Ohio, the rest is history. Joe Hazelbaker is such an amazing guy. And Whaley, Jason Talkman, I mean, just astonishing people. And we didn't know it at the time. They're just people. But, in retrospect, just the finest human beings. So we had two meetings here at the Lazy Black Bear in December of 1990 and January of 1991, where we invited these folks we'd met in these other states. And down in Kentucky was Al Fritsch and the Schimlers. Chris at that time was on a Fulbright scholarship in India. She didn't get back till later, but Kathy Guthrie took the helm of Kentucky Heartwood. But that's a whole other story, is the Kentucky Heartwood and the development of groups in other states, because we helped see where there wasn't a group. We helped seed these other groups, and we helped, because we provide a framework within which people didn't feel so alone and did not feel like theirs was a voice crying in the wilderness, so to speak, because suddenly it turns out, no, there's not very many of us. But guess what? We represent some deeply held values, and we share those values, and we've met other people who speak from those same places and express that same love and that same joy and that same desire to do something meaningful, important with their lives. We met and we started Heartwood. Now, at that time, I came up with two different names for us to consider as names for this new regional cooperative network, because it was not going to be a new organization. The intention was not to start another organization. So we didn't need another organization. What we needed was a framework within which we could provide mutual assistance and cooperative bonding and pool our knowledge, apply our skills, and see what happens. Well, the Forest Service in Illinois had a timber sale called the Fairview Timber Sale. And to understand Heartwood, you have to understand the Fairview Timber Sale. The Fairview Timber Sale, I can't remember how many acres it was, but it was prime old growth hardwood forest, not too far from Pomona in southwestern Illinois in the Shawnee. And the locals there were actually further along in many ways than we were with Protector Woods. They had a vibrant Earth First network in Southern Illinois, something that actually never really manifested in Indiana. Because for whatever reason, Protect Our Woods decided to do everything in its power to work within the system and use the existing tools to achieve our objectives. And what's interesting about our success with Protect Our Woods and stopping the logging is we didn't stop the logging with a lawsuit. We didn't stop it with direct action. We didn't stop it through legislation. We just stopped it. It just happened through an expression of public will, an organized expression of public sentiment within the framework of the legitimate avenues by which people are allowed under the Constitution to express their preferences. So that, I think, is significant. Well, in Illinois, they had done all of the others. They had the entire Illinois congressional delegation, except for one, I think, on a letter saying, do not cut the Fairview timber sale. They'd gone through the courts. They had gotten a favorable ruling in the lower courts. I may be getting this wrong. Anyway, the lawsuit was on appeal to the district court. They had a piece of legislation in Congress sponsored by Sidney Yates, the ranking member of the House Interior Appropriations Subcommittee on Appropriations, which meant that this is the guy who controlled the purse strings. And he had a rider on a bill in Congress that precluded the Forest Service from using any money appropriated to the Forest Service to cut the Fairview timber sale. They had an 80-day occupation of the site by Earth First. They'd done everything that they could think of to stop the sale. And even with the opposition of the entire Illinois congressional delegation, the pending legislation in Congress, a pending appeal in federal district court, or actually, I guess it was in the appellate court. Some of these details I may have wrong, but you get the sense of what I'm saying is that you could not have had a more clearly expressed manifestation of public sentiment than they were able to mobilize in Southern Illinois. And the Forest Service went ahead and logged it anyway. With the case pending, with the legislation pending, and with this clear opposition. And the opposition started with ragtag band of Earth Firsters and some hippies and some college dropouts and PhDs and MBAs or whoever, all the people that made up these local groups. But they were starting to get more and more support from the local community too. But the Forest Service went ahead and logged Fairview. There were dozens of people arrested. People came from all over Heartwood came together at Fairview. People came from Indiana. People came from Missouri. People came from Virginia. People came from Ohio. People came from Kentucky to be there and to bear witness. And we found out later that the Forest Service, I think they sold the timber for $50,000. We found out later they could have bought the sale back from the loggers for $11,000 through a Freedom of Information Act. But instead of buying the sale back for $11,000, they spent over $350,000 to bring in law enforcement from all around the country. There was Forest Service law enforcement from California, from Colorado, and God knows where all else, to keep the public out of the forest while they went in and logged it. Chris Van Dalen, I don't know if you ever knew Chris, but Chris was one of the founders of Save America's Forest. He came out from DC, and in one particularly noteworthy protest, as the loggers were driving into the forest, Chris lay down in front of the pickup truck driven by the crew boss for the logging crew, drove right over Chris. And he wound up in the hospital. But nobody was arrested for that, needless to say. But we were all arrested. There was a very memorable scene in my mind where Mike Mitter, I believe was his last name. And
Mike Mittage?
Yeah, Mike Mittage. Thank you, Mike. Dear soul. I have not seen him in years. But Mike and Ann Peterman, who was there as an observer, she was there with like a press badge. And I thought, because we knew the loggers were coming in that morning. And so we thought, let's go this way. Everybody's expecting him to come this way. So we go down this road. I think we must have walked. And here we are like 6 or 8 in the morning, whatever time it is. And there's like 13 log trucks in a row, or maybe not 13, however many it was. And, the pickup truck in the front. And it's just me. I felt like that guy in Tiananmen Square. I just stopped in the road and stopped them for half an hour, before law enforcement came and asked us to move. And I was not ready for an arrest scenario at that point, but we stayed with them. We documented it. I wonder if Ann still has some footage of that, because it was a profound moment. It's just like, stop, stop. And of course, it held them off for maybe half an hour, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. But it felt good to at least put my body on the line to that extent. But they went ahead and cut Fairview. And at a cost, like I say, of over $350,000 in law enforcement. And Forest Service never recovered. I mean, yes, they had other sales planned. I think they even implemented a couple more Whoopee Cat and a couple others. But the reality is that they had so mobilized public sentiment that it was at that point only a matter of time. Because Mark was brilliant at reading the Forest Service regs, reading the law, and finding out where the weaknesses were in the Forest Service's documentation for the proposals they were taking. So Mark took the Forest Service to court pro se, no lawyer. They didn't have any money. We didn't have any money on numerous occasions, and each time he lost. But what happened was each time he got before the judge, because each time they assigned him to the same judge, Judge Gilbert, because he was the one who at that point was starting to have some knowledge of the terrain and the landscape and the legal framework. Mark eventually persuaded Judge Gilbert that, yes, we're pro se. Yes, we don't have any idea what we're doing, but we have read the law and we've read the administrative regs, and they are in violation. And Mark eventually, and Mark and Jim Bensman and Joe Glisson, Sam Stearns, John Wallace, that whole amazing team of people, they got an injunction on logging on the Shawnee. Well, anyway, that was later in the framework of Heartwood by that time. And at that point, we'd actually been doing enough and having enough of a track record that we were able to attract some high quality attorneys to our cause. And so litigation then became a major tool in our toolkit. And I'm actually going to stop now because I've been saying a lot of things. I just want to see if there's any questions you want to pick up on any loose ends before I continue the narrative.
Are you going to go back in your narrative to how you had 2 names in mind and you were having a meeting at the Lazy Black Bear?
Yes. So those 2 names were Heartwood, which was my mashup of Heartland, the forest we were trying to defend. I was still working within the framework of Protector Woods at that point. And we discovered there was a thing called the Central Hardwood Forest. And the lines, and there were lots of different maps sort of delineating where that region was. But it's a roughly heart-shaped region that extends into the river valleys of the states to the west of the Mississippi and up into the foothills of the Appalachians in the east, and actually all the way out to Massachusetts on some maps. But it was sort of like 2 lobes. It was like a heart. And it's definitely the heartland. And I mean, we're talking about the big rivers here. We're talking about the Mississippi. We're talking about the Ohio. We're talking about the Missouri. All these beautiful, diverse hills and valleys draining into these big rivers. And the forest that grew from this rich, fertile soil in this area that gets abundant rainfall and has a very agreeable climate. It has 4 seasons. It has a full winter, full spring, full summer, full fall, although it's more like 12 different seasons because they're interspersed. It's not like it goes automatically from one to the next, although more recently it seems like it's doing that. So one name was Heartland Heartwood, and the other was Grace, the Greater Regional Association of Concerned Environmentalists. And we said, too contrived. Heartwood. Heartwood is definitely the name. So we became Heartwood, and it's such a great name. If you can say everything you need to say in one word that can't be reduced to an acronym, that has everything you're trying to say within 2 syllables, Heartwood, I mean, we were blessed. And right around that time too, we used to have these things with our friends in Bloomington. We'd have a pasta party where we had a pasta maker, and we'd go to a different house each time, and somebody would make whatever kind of pasta they wanted. We'd all come and do a pitch in. And at one of these pasta parties, my dear friend Perry Old says, Andy, I have something I think you should have. And I can't tell you how many times this has happened in my life, and especially in the framework of the work I've done with Heartwood and the other subsequent projects. But he shows me this picture. Well, he shows me this picture of what has come to be known as the tree guy, and says, Andy, I think you should have this. And I said, what is that? And where did you find that? And, once again, this is where things recede into the dim mists of memory and history, because he got it from some guy who worked for the DNR, I think. But then when he later asked that guy, the guy couldn't remember. We don't know where it came from. We don't know who the guy is. We don't know where it was taken. We don't even know when it was taken. Based on the clothing and certain other aspects of it, it seems to be very early 20th century. But I mean, if you look in that guy's face, I don't know if you can see that, if I'm holding it right, but
Yeah.
he has this look where it's either abject horror, resignation, or determination. We do not know, but this is this look where it's like his eyes don't have pupils. It's like, I don't know. But I mean, there's something happening here. And the tree is very special too, because it's a black gum tree. And one thing you will not find in the eastern United States is a black gum tree that size. It's also called a tupelo. It's just a magnificent photo, magnificent tree. It's a picture with 1,000 stories, but no clear source. So it's perfect for Heartwood in the sense that it just came to represent everything we were about, which is sort of a determination. We may not succeed. It won't be because we didn't try. So between the name and the guy, I have a Heartwood shirt on, but it's a different Heartwood shirt. We had our core message, and there were never that many of us, but we did everything we did with great joy, immense determination, great companionship, and sense of community. And when I talk about how Protect Our Woods, we thought was a forest protection organization, but turned out it was actually about justice, this fundamental, profound value in the human experience: justice, decency, kindness. With Heartwood, we thought we were creating a regional cooperative forest protection network, but in fact, we were creating a virtual community. This was before the internet, mind you. This was before cell phones. This was before answering machines. We didn't even have answering machines. The first real great innovation that sort of brought us together technologically. I'm sure I've got the sequencing on some of this stuff wrong, but the reality is we were working in a very, very different landscape, both sort of in terms of technology, communications, political landscape. But we were adaptive, we were resourceful, we were industrious, and we were creative. And what we were able to do, the Forest Service never figured this out for a good long while, is they were doing projects haphazardly. There'd be one in Missouri, there'd be one in Kentucky, one in Ohio. And we were able to mobilize our regional resources to focus the entire regional community on one project at a time, up to a point. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but we were able to project far more power than we ever actually had. But the reality is, power is all about projection. If people believe you have power, you have power. And we started scaring the Forest Service. They started doing a smear campaign. They sent spies to our events and stuff. They opened dossiers on us. They, were turning stuff over to the FBI. We were being effective. And then, as I think I may have mentioned before, we established Heartwood based on a policy and a principle. And the principle was that all land is considered sacred until proven otherwise. and the policy was that we would never sacrifice someone else's beloved place in order to protect our beloved place. The forest would dictate where we would move, where we would act, and the forest would dictate how we would frame our logic and our arguments. And there were three major arguments at that time. I think this is what we really successfully projected in Indiana with protector woods. The three major arguments, they're sort of the ecological. And I think everybody sort of granted us that we had that one, that protecting the forest is going to be better for the forest than cutting it down. But that does not get you anywhere in the Congress. So the other two were economics. And Bob Clowder, whose dear widow Kathy was over here visiting yesterday. So we had a good long talk about Bob and about our experiences over the past 40 years. But Bob did this amazing, amazing research. Bob had a voluminous capacity to engage with intellectual thought and raw data and to pull these pieces together and articulate a logical framework within which to understand. And Bob had analyzed the raw timber inventory data, because at that time the Forest Service was requiring every state to do an inventory of their timber resources. And Bob took this raw data and determined a couple things that were a big surprise to everybody. One, there was more timber growing than being cut. I won't go into all the details, but the reality was there's more than enough timber growing and being cut on privately owned land to supply all the needs of the industry. And Indiana has a very important timber industry. It's the third largest, or hardwood timber industry, the third largest hardwood timber industry in the nation, I think both by volume and by dollar amount. Little Indiana, which has only maybe 20% of the land base of the state covered with quote unquote forest, and areas that recently been clear cut are still considered forest by those definitions. But that we had, and the other two, by the way, are Pennsylvania and North Carolina, both of which are dominated by, the forested landscape. So I'm just saying, we got some beautiful trees here. And the Forest Service saw those trees as revenue. They didn't see them as ecosystems. And when I say that, there are lots of good people who work for the Forest Service. Most of the people who go to work for that agency do it for the right reasons. But the reality is, once you become part of the Forest Service, you realize, even though their motto is caring for the land and serving people, the highest priority is taking care of the Forest Service budget. And that's just a sad fact of life, is that, and there's actually some economic theories that support this, and our friend Randall O'Toole was one of the ones who brought some of these things to our attention. But so anyway, the economics, we found we could beat them on the economic arguments. They were losing money on their timber sales. There was more than enough timber growing on private land to supply all the needs of industry, not just for domestic production and consumption, but for export. So there was no need to cut a single tree off the Hoosier National Forest for economic reasons. So ecologically, we felt we had it in the bag. Economically, Bob demonstrated conclusively that we had a much stronger argument than they did. And then the third piece is demographics, and that is public opinion, because these are publicly owned lands. So one of the things that really tipped the balance in our favor on the Hoosier was I had back in 1988 run for county commissioner because I wanted to stop the logging in the forest. And I felt that if I was in a position of an elected position, I'd be in much stronger shape to advance our collective will that we were expressing on behalf of the citizens of the county. So I'd run for county commissioner, and in the process of doing that, I'd gotten to know a guy pretty well, who I'd known before, but never well, a guy named Frank McCloskey, who'd been mayor of Bloomington and was running for Congress. And so I lost, Frank won, but we had helped Frank get elected because we had run an ad that was not pro McCloskey or anti McIntyre, but we just ran something that showed a picture of me with up to my shins in a muddy rut in the Hoosier National Forest, saying something like, and this was during the ORV battles, saying something like, these vehicles won't do any harm to the forest, or words to that effect. And Frank felt that our tacit support had helped him win that squeaker. So the next time he's running, and I'm assuming this is 1990, Frank says, Andy, I'm doing some internal polling and I'd like your help. We want to ask a question about the national forest. What should we ask? And I said, Frank, why don't you ask the question nobody's ever bothered to ask? And this is literally true. As far as I know, there had never been a single poll anywhere in the country that had asked the people of the United States whether they favored logging in the national forests. So he sanitized it a little. He said, do you support or oppose the harvest and sale of timber from the Hoosier National Forest? And he only asked the question in his congressional district, the 8th congressional district. So he asked this question, nobody knew. There was no data out there. So we would, as I've said many times in the past, we would have been delighted with a 50-50 split, because the presumption was in a poor rural county with a significant timber industry like Orange County. This goes back to that thing I was saying earlier about the areas around Indianapolis and Bloomington where, you know, the relatively well-to-do recreationists lived, and where they would, you know, where the forest was being protected, at least to some extent. They'd established a wilderness area up there and so on. But the presumption was nobody else, the people in the southern part of the state don't care about the forest. You know, for them, it's a resource. And there was a fairly common thing we would hear, well, a tree that falls in the forest is just going to waste. You might as well cut it and get some economic value out of it before it dies. So when the poll results came back and 69% of the voters said no logging at all, and that was the same regardless of party. Now, there was a slight distinction between men and women. Women were more likely to support protection than men, and an age variant too, where older men were more likely to support the logging, younger people and women more likely to support protection. In fact, one of the cohorts that they separated out in the polling was voters 18 to 35. And among voters 18 to 35, it was 79% opposed to the logging. So we had political gold there. And we've used that club since then. We've wielded that club to say, basically, these are publicly owned forests. You've never bothered to ask the public whether they want their forest logged. And when a member of Congress does finally get around to asking it, you choose to ignore the results. So that's, of course, why they spent the last 30 years coming up with this term restoration, because it has all to do with focus groups and messaging. And they've also spent the last 30 years, very interestingly, researching and documenting the small handful of species that benefit from clear cutting.
Mm-hmm.
So now they don't talk about the neotropical migratory songbirds and all the myriad species that require deep, dense, closed canopy forest. Now they focus exclusively on things like that prairie warbler. They're managing the Hoosier National Forest for something called the prairie warbler. But that's what they're doing. So they found a handful of species, some birds, and they'll just do anything to get in there and be able to cut the trees. Because the other thing that's happened since we stopped the logging is that the Congress, in their infinite wisdom, has decided that in order to get the Forest Service bought into this notion that the forests need to be managed, and of course the Forest Service didn't need much persuasion on that one, but needs to be logged, they allow the Forest Service to keep the money from selling the trees. The timber industry gets the trees. The Congress gets donations from their friends in the timber industry. The Forest Service keeps the money, and the public gets the stumps. That's your national forest, all in the name of restoration. That will bring us up to Buffalo Springs eventually, but back to any other questions you might have.
Well, I'm wondering how we can frame this, because it sounds like Heartwood was founded in 1991, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
And then, you know, here we are, it's 2025, and Heartwood is still a thing, but it also went through like a whole
so many
iterations.
That's the word. No, that's a good point. Because here's the deal is, what we had was this initial just absolute moment where people came together with a shared sense of love, a shared sense of connection to their places, which then quickly and seamlessly extended to the other people who shared that love, but for different places. We had this amazing group of people. But, you know, in terms of people who would come to Heartwood meetings, it was not very many people. We might have 13, we might have 25. And then obviously when we would have a larger gathering, and then in 1991, we had our first Heartwood Forest Council, and we can go into that a little bit if you want, in Southern Illinois, obviously Fairview and everything. And people came, including Forest Service infiltrators. But people who came to that meeting came away with something, something powerful. And that something powerful was to belong to something larger than themselves. And in a deep and profound way. And what we were also able to do, like I say, is to marshal regional resources to apply to local challenges in ways that we were able to use very effectively. So we established as our principle, no logging. First, Protect Our Woods was the first organization to call for an end to logging in the national forests in the country, as far as I know. The very first in the country, Protect Our Woods, right here in Orange County. Now, don't get me wrong, Earth First had always been saying that, but Earth First was never an organization. Earth First was a principle, and it was something that people did based on their personal, obligations and responsibilities. Whereas Heartwood was an organizational structure within the framework of the IRS 501c3 not-for-profit, all that stuff. So when we would go to Washington to lobby, we spent we spent at least as much time lobbying the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, the Wilderness Society, and National Wildlife Federation as we did lobbying the members of Congress, because you'd go into a congressional office and they'd say, well, where's the Sierra Club on this? Because they knew the answer. Sierra Club had their lobbyists who wanted to be in the room when the decisions were being made. But I guarantee that decision was not going to be no logging. So what the Sierra Club was desperately trying to do is protect the jewels and the gems. And in exchange for protecting these jewels and gems, they would sign off on these hideous forest management plans that allowed the rest of the forest to be logged without people even knowing the jewels and gems that were in these areas that were being proposed for logging. So I got to know all the Forest Service the big green lobbyists out there. Some of them are still dear friends, Fran Hunt, Mike Francis. And we did not gain much traction, but at the very least, we were able to get them to back off cutting deals. And here's a real important meeting that led to the formation of Heartwood too. Those same four organizations I just mentioned, Wilderness Society, Sierra Club, Audubon, National Wildlife Federation, had a forest activist training at a camp. I'm pretty sure it was in Ohio near Cincinnati. It was right in the heart of the Heartwood region. And I thought, oh my gosh, thank goodness. People are finally paying attention to what we've been saying, that these eastern forests are treasures. They deserve protection. So I go to this conference organized by these big green groups. And one of the great things about this particular conference is that one of the people there making a presentation was Lenny Kuhn. I think you probably knew Lenny, but he was the one who organized to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge.
Okay.
And Lenny, one of my all-time heroes, one of the finest human beings I've ever known. Anyway, I got to meet Lenny. So that was a big plus there. And we became fast friends and had a lifetime of collaboration and fellowship based on our shared love for the natural world and our dedication to being full-time organizers and activists to protect the best of what was left of the wild. But the other thing I found at this Eastern Forest Activist Organizing Conference was there wasn't a single item on the program to talk about the eastern forests. It was to mobilize eastern forest activists to protect the forests of California, the forests of Alaska, the forests of Montana, everywhere else, but not. And I said, I remember one of the guys who worked for the Sierra Club at the time, Carl Zakelli, was the head of their Madison office. I said, Carl, we were coming here trying to get some help from these large organizations with budgets and staff and access to try and protect our eastern forests, our central hardwood forests. And I said, we were looking to you guys for leadership. And he said, don't look to us, lead. Mm-hmm. So, it was an absolute betrayal, but it was also some of the best advice I ever got, because, the Sierra Club since then has become a no-cut organization. And that didn't just happen. That happened because of the work that we and others did to make it clear that it was a politically viable position. Anyway, at the time we adopted that position, it was far from politically viable. We couldn't even get buy-in from those groups, let alone from the congressional delegations. So then we, as I said, we were trying everything. We were working with the press a lot. We were lobbying wherever we felt we could be effective. We traveled to Washington, D.C. time and time and time again. Gwen Marshall, Joe Hazelbaker, Tom Bushell, Jim Bensman, all of us were out there one time or another. We pursued litigation and actually wound up with at least one case before the Supreme Court. But over time, we found that one of the most effective tools for us was the NFMA, the National Forest Management Act, because it included a provision in there that required the Forest Service to maintain minimum viable populations. And I can't remember which species specifically. It wasn't just rare, threatened, and endangered. I think it was, maybe it was rare, threatened, and endangered, but whatever it was, that was a clause that was not made. It was thou shalt. And so they were not doing that. In particular, what we found is one of the species that was, it may have been the very first, but certainly one of the very first species listed under the Endangered Species Act, and we also use that act too, of course, and the Neo-Tropical Migratory Bird Treaty Act was the Indiana bat. Indiana bat may have been the very first listed species. And the Indiana bat, what does it like? It likes hardwood forest. Hardwood forest where there are caves. And that's Indiana, that's Kentucky, that's Missouri, that's Ohio. And so using our team of self-trained, self-taught pro se litigants with the other attorneys who they've been able to attract through the quality of their work, including Tom Bushell, who was working pro bono for us at that time out of a huge law firm in Chicago. And Tom Bushell, he's from Illinois originally, and Tom came down, and he and Mark became very fast friends and became very, very close collaborators. And Tom, and then a whole string of other attorneys over time came to us. Matt, I can't begin to think of all their names, and I apologize in advance that I'm not calling to mind all their names. But we were suddenly being represented by first-class lawyers in some of these cases too. And so we won on the Shawnee. We'd already shut down on the Hoosier, so we didn't need to litigate on the Hoosier. We won on the Wayne in Ohio. We won on the Daniel Boone in Kentucky. Hoosier National Forest, under 200,000 acres at that time. Shawnee National Forest, 360,000 acres maybe. Daniel Boone, close between 700,000 and 800,000 acres. Allegheny National Forest, big money forest for the Forest Service because the black cherry shut them down. I think 900,000 acres. And then the big prize, the Mark Twain, as you know, 1.5 million acres, shut down their entire timber program. It got to the point where at one point we were doing an organizing tour down south just to, because Heartwood was expanding. We were trying to find people who shared our values and our principles and our commitment in every state. And some places we find one person. Some places we find three. Some places we find an organization. But it was tough sailing at first, and it was slim pickings, but it didn't matter. Because when you found the right people, you found the right people. And then we had our team, and we were able to get in court. And then we had Jim Bensman and Charles Phillips and others doing this thing where we were appealing every single decision that the Forest Service was issuing through our Jim Bensman's appeal-o-mat or whatever it was, like the system where you just plugged in the numbers, you plugged in the name, and then you cited the appropriate references to the National Forest Management Act, those other laws. And the Forest Service was beside themselves because they'd never had to follow the law before. They would just say they were doing something, and if there's nobody to challenge them, they would just conduct the sales. Well, once we started challenging them, and we started getting in court in front of these judges, and these weren't necessarily sympathetic judges. Their violations were so clear and unambiguous that the courts just started ruling in our favor. And they didn't say you can never log again. They just said the sale has to be in compliance with these acts. So at one point, within 10 years of our founding, even though what I say now is that our position of ending logging in the national forest wouldn't even pass the laugh test. when we go in the congressional office and they say, how can I help you? And you say, we want to stop logging the national forest. It's like, but no, within 10 years of Heartwood's founding, we had, through the courts mostly, shut down logging in like 8 different national forests. And it truly is a remarkable success story. Now, none of those lasted. They're logging in the Hoosier, they're logging on the Shawnee. 17-year injunction on the Shawnee. As soon as they lifted it, restoration magically becomes the name and the term of art.
Well, how do you deal with that? Like having had such huge success, and the organization was growing, and there was funding for what Heartwood was doing because of its success, and then like that things regress. Like, what do you make of it?
Well, there's a number of things that you can make of, but one thing, there's no question about that. We attracted the attention of Forest Service law enforcement, and we attracted the attention of the industry, and we attracted the ire of important decision makers within the Forest Service, to where there was an active campaign to discredit us, to divide us. I mean, there was a period of time when one of the games I would play is, okay, who's the infiltrator, who's the spy, who's the whatever you want to call it. And, I may have carried that to a ridiculous extreme, but there's no question in my mind that our activities were being monitored. At one time in the Heartwood office in Bloomington, Dave Broden at the time was our financial, sort of coordinator, and the Heartwood laptop was having trouble, so he sent it back to IBM to be repaired. And when he got the notice that it was ready to be picked up, it was to be picked up at the FBI office. People were rewiring the Heartwood office while we were in there. Now, this was after I'd already retired from Heartwood, mind you, but the fact that things went a little cockeyed was not entirely our own doing. Now, it is also my experience that nothing sort of sets back an environmental organization further than success, because once you've achieved your objective and you have all these intensely focused, dynamic, creative people who've been working shoulder to shoulder, suddenly some of those things tend to turn on each other. And there were a couple of issues, and the Forest Service was able to exploit them very effectively. One of those was the issue of fire, where some people within Heartwood thought that fire was an entirely legitimate and appropriate management tool. And I don't disagree with that possibility that it is, but certainly not on the scope and scale and the intensity with which it's being implemented now. But anyway, fire was one of the issues that started to tear Heartwood apart. And there were others, including personnel things and just people being people. And, so, I mean, to our credit, the Heartwood family connection proved deeper than the things that caused us dismay along the way. And those things that caused dismay, many of them are still out there unresolved. And that's just part of being a human being and having to learn to accept and live with that. But I tell you what, I'm pretty certain I can guarantee is that there's no person who's been closely involved with Heartwood who regrets that involvement. Now maybe there were personal issues that caused people to leave. Maybe there were policy issues that caused people to leave. But the fundamental flavor, that fundamental heart connection that we made with each other, and that was based in large part on that fundamental heart connection each of us had individually to the land we loved, that is so strong. Even when people have moved away from the Heartwood region, I'm sure on some level they still consider themselves Heartwood. I think
Well, that's me.
They're still very proud of the work that we did together and very proud of what we were able to accomplish with no money. Yes, you said money came in, but guess what? We never had any money. Yeah, we had a little money for a while, but one thing our money did not tend to go for was salaries. And that's not to our credit, because people need to be paid and people need to be able to make a living. Yes, people got paid, but it was like bare minimum because we did not have that much money. One thing, the things we decided early on, one of our first, we got a donation of like $16,000 or something. And people thought I should be being paid because I was being paid in the early years of Heart, was being paid $1 a year, just so nominally, just so that it would be represented that Heartwood hasn't a paid employee. But so when we did have enough money to pay $16,000, instead of paying me $16,000, I said, no, $4,000 is going to Leah Garlot for doing the blood route. $4,000 is going to Jim Bensman for doing the litigation and appeals work. and 4,000 is going to Phil Burke for doing the administrative and financial end of things and trying to keep us focused and trying to keep revenue coming in. We've always tried to spread stuff out. Heartwood has never been about taking credit, although of course we have deserved some credit. We've taken some. That was always much more important to us to support the local groups and for the local groups to get the credit and the local groups to write the grants and get the funding. You know, Heartwood was a cooperative network of activists and individuals and small local groups. So there was that cooperative function that really, I think, defined Heartwood. And a lot of that came from Leo Garlot's deep involvement with the bioregional movement, where we became a family. And, you know, within a family, the ideal is to make sure nobody does without and everybody gets what they need, you know, within the limits of our ability to provide those things. So one of the things I think also that defined Heartwood and distinguishes us from so many other groups around the country, and the other groups have looked to Heartwood with admiration, is one is that it wasn't about ego and credit and turf, although obviously all those things played in factors at different times. It was about this sense of community, you know, and that we really loved each other. Now, obviously, loving another human being is fraught. You don't love everything about them. Each of us is flawed. Each of us does things that others may not approve of. But nonetheless, the fundamental connection there is that we are human beings doing the best we can figure out to do to make the world a better place. And so we always, you know, we didn't just focus on the work. The work is what brought us together, but the work without context ends when the work ends. We were dedicated to being the whole thing. We wanted to deal with the whole person. We wanted to develop each of us our communication skills. We wanted to develop our leadership skills. Everybody in Heartwood got a chance to guide the circle through conversations from time to time. Everybody in Heartwood, and one of the rules was those who were there make the decisions. You know, we're not waiting to hear from the other people who didn't come to the meeting. The presumption is, and this is a lot of this is in the consensus process, you're not making a decision based on your values. Yes, you are, of course, it's on your values, but you're making decisions based on what you think is in the best interest of the whole group, knowing that some people in that group may have a different vantage point or a different perspective or a different opinion about certain things. And we will talk about it and work through it until everybody signs off on the agreement. We never did a 51% agreement thing in our entire existence. If we could not reach a meaningful consensus on an issue, we would have to either put it aside, people would have to drop out, or we would just struggle through until we found something that everybody could articulate. Everybody could say, it may not be exactly what I wanted, but I could not just live with this, but I can advocate for this. And the other piece of that, though, is we realized that, you know, it's not just the guys who are doing the litigation. It's not just the people who are lobbying in Washington, D.C. It's not just the people who are writing the press releases. Heartwood valued the people who were cooking the meals. Heartwood valued the people who were washing the dishes. Heartwood valued the people who came to play music for the people who were washing the dishes and preparing the meals. That was Heartwood. It was, yeah, there were those of us who were out in front, sort of at the interface between our network and every other facet of the society with which we interacted. But we always tried to gather in a place where there was a wild river, a wild forest, or something beautiful nearby. We would be in the places that we wanted to protect. We never met like at an airport conference room or something like that. We never met at a Ramada Inn. You know, we would meet in people's homes and we would prepare meals communally. And one of the things that really got us really rolling was this notion that, you know, when we're small, everybody's involved in every decision. But at some point we realized there's not that many of us and there's a whole lot of stuff needs to get done. So let's break out into working groups. So often at a meeting, instead of everybody sitting in a circle, which we would do, at some point we break into, you guys are going to deal with our public messaging. You guys are going to develop the litigation and appeals strategy. And you guys are going to do, you know, whatever else, do the research and bring in the science, because we always based on the best available science. That was one of the ways we beat the Forest Service, because our science was always better than their science. Because they didn't have to. They just had to cherry pick the ones that validated their predetermined outcome, whereas we were determined to look at what was best for the forest and use the science that talked about what was best for the forest in our decision-making process. So we break out into these working groups. And what the magical thing that happened was, it turns out that everybody came to have this deep level of trust that any decision that was made in the other working groups would be at least as good as that decision would have been if you had participated in that decision, as you being in a different working group. So the working groups would come back and report, and then we get consensus on the whole package. And it was really that we learned that we had each other's backs, and that everybody brought their best game. And by doing that, we could also specialize in those things that people felt they were best at. If you're good at writing appeals or reading regulations, not me, you do that. If you're good at interfacing with the public and telling a story, yeah, maybe that's me. But if you're best just like preparing the meal and washing the dishes and participating in the music afterwards, we love you. Thank you. Thank you so much. So we really developed this framework within which every Heartwood meeting included great local food, prepared lovingly by the people who participated. Sometimes we would bring in people who were just there to cook. And every Heartwood gathering would have music that we'd make for ourselves. We would always sit around afterwards. We have a lot of very creative people in Heartwood and great songwriters, incredible musicians, Danny Dolinger, Robert Hoyt, Mark Donham. I mean, my goodness. And more and more and more. And poets and raconteurs, and Denny Haldeman, one of the funniest human beings ever placed on the earth because of his way with words. And speaking of funny people with a way with words, Linda Lee is in a class by herself, but maybe Denny's there too, just in terms of wordplay and just making people laugh. Just take something somebody said and just apply a few more words to it, and everybody just breaks out laughing. So anyway, we had great humor, great food, great music, and we would always do it a way where, you know, when the Heartwood meeting was over, we didn't just get in our cars and run off. I mean, some people had to, but we get in the woods. We get in the water. You know, one thing I always did, whenever we go to a new place, Linda and I were organizing, or I'd be by myself, or Heartwood was in a new location, I would get in the water. I'd find a local creek, a lake, a pond, whatever, because I really felt like, well, each time, each immersion was like a recreation, a renovation, a renewal, but also a connection.
That's the word. That's the word, Andy. That's what's coming up for me as you talk. I just keep thinking it, at least in my experience going to these Heartwood events, was always about connecting with the other people
Oh my gosh.
and with the landscape, you know, the local area. And then by having that very experiential experience of that
Immersion, yeah.
area, then you care about it in a different way.
Absolutely. And I, you know, I mean, I think of the places that we got the rivers in the Ozarks. I mean, the old growth forests in the Appalachians, the incredibly deep sort of spiritual depth of the landscape in southeastern Ohio, which was the heart of the Shawnee Nation, and the earthworks there. I mean, and down Chattanooga on the Tennessee River and the mountains. I mean, you know, we were so enriched by just being woven into each other's lives to where we really became family in ways that sort of other familial bonds can't really touch, because because we also saw horrors. You know, I mean, we lost something like mountaintop removal. I mean, it destroys me still. That couldn't save them. But so to go through that together brings people together with unbreakable bonds.
I really appreciate you telling me the story of how Heartwood came into existence. I think it's important to have it down somewhere. And do you have a vision for where you would want to see it go, or just keep going the way it's going? Is there anything that you have to offer about the future?
You know, I think here's the thing that's very cool about Heartwood is that there's so many people who are part of Heartwood without even realizing it, because they already have that connection to the land. And it's only that by discovering that there's an organization called Heartwood exists do they realize that they're already part of something larger than themselves. And I think that's the biggest piece right there, is being part of something larger than yourself. And in this case, that thing is not Heartwood. It's a living planet. And we're not separate from the planet as much as we might imagine we can fly off to Mars and do something there after we've destroyed the only planet we've got. It's not about going to Mars. It's about learning to live with your neighbors. See, one thing that distinguishes Protect Our Woods, Protect Our Woods basically dissolved itself. Protect Our Woods, they were still an organization by that name, but they weren't really engaged, and there was not a current generation of activists. So they let I hadn't been involved with Protect Our Woods on a formal capacity in 30 years or something. But so they allowed the 501c3 to lapse. They allowed the corporate status to lapse. But guess what? When the Buffalo Springs project came back up, Protect Our Woods hadn't gone anywhere. Protect Our Woods is always here. Heartwood is always here. Fortunately, we have a name. Protect Our Woods has a name. Heartwood has a name. So as long as the need is there, it will manifest within that form. But if the need's not there, it will continue to exist in a dormant form. But guess what? The need is only increasing for both Protect Our Woods and Heartwood. And what's very cool is that Heartwood has gone through a lot. Things that would have torn other organizations apart. Heartwood never let the C3 lapse. Heartwood never stopped having meetings. Heartwood never stopped having dedicated activists dedicated to trying to make sure that the forests would be protected to the extent possible. Now, obviously, we're dealing with a whole new range of threats, a whole new cast of characters. I mean, every single person who worked for the Forest Service last time I was engaged with Protect Our Woods is gone. I mean, some are dead, some are retired, but there's not a single person that's still there. As recently as a couple of years ago, there's still one, Pam Cruz, who was the secretary there. And what's interesting is I have a very deep and strong affectionate relationship with Pam Cruz. I have deep affectionate relationships with people who work for the Forest Service. This is not about vanquishing or dominating or prevailing. It's about expressing the best you have to offer in a way that does the least harm to others. Now, obviously, I have bedeviled and belittled and mocked the Forest Service at great length, but it's not because I despise the agency. It's because they are not living up to their own mission, their own principles. It's because the agency has failed the people. The people have not failed the agency. And it's not their fault. I mean, I understand that these are economic decisions. Why is the Forest Service doing so much burning in the eastern hardwood forest? Because they have a huge pot of money to fight forests in the West, but it doesn't say that they can only be used in the West. They can use those fire dollars anywhere in the country, and they cannot possibly spend them all unless they just throw dollar bills out of airplanes fighting the fires in the West. And they do throw dollar bills out of airplanes in the West, I might add. All that aerial spraying of fire retardant is an obscenity. All it does is pollute local water supplies, and it's for show on the nightly news. That's what all that fire retardant dropping is, just for show on the nightly news, so people will think the Forest Service is doing something. You can't put out those fires with fire retardant. All you're doing is polluting the water supplies for the people lucky enough to survive the fires. The only thing that puts out those mega fires in the West is rain. And obviously, I'm sure they're trying to figure out how to make it rain. But talk to the people in Texas about that. But so it's really about learn to live with your neighbors, because what has happened with Protect Our Woods, 40 years later, whatever it's been, when we had to revive Protect Our Woods, suddenly we find our neighbors coming up to us and saying, Andy, you were right. We used to think you were just a bunch of crazy tree huggers, but we're so grateful that you protected the forest 40 years ago, because now we have a forest in the other counties around here maybe don't. And so we've done it again with Buffalo Springs, and we'll talk about that next time, because we now have the highest quality, highest value hardwoods in North America, right here in Orange County. I mean, that's not because they're exceptional. It's just that they're still standing.
Right.
And there are wonderful, high quality, high value hardwoods in many other places. But guess what? We know what we have, and we're dedicated to doing whatever we have to do to make sure they continue to be there for future generations. Because the forest I'm protecting is not the forest that's out there right now. It's the forest that's going to be there in 400 years. Who knows what the planet's going to look like in 400 years? But if I have anything to say about it, if my life has had any meaning, it will include a healthy, diverse, vibrant hardwood forest in Orange County.
Amazing. That's a great place to end.
Well, thank you, Jillian. Thank you for doing this. Because I'll tell you what, I'm a good writer. I have a way with words, but there's nothing like the spoken word, because the word goes directly from the mouth into the ear. Whereas there's all sorts of intermediaries when you're writing, somebody's reading. All right, I guess I better take this call.
Okay. All right. I love you.
Love you. I'll see you.